The courtroom fell silent as the little boy stood up, his small frame trembling but his voice clear and steady. "I saw her do it," he said, pointing to the woman sitting at the defense table. Gasps rippled through the packed room, followed by murmurs that the judge quickly silenced. The boy's eyes met the woman's, and her face turned pale. She shook her head slightly, mouthing, "No," but he didn't waver. "I know what I saw," the boy continued, "and it wasn't an accident." The woman's attorney jumped to his feet, objecting loudly, but the damage was already done. The boy's brave words had turned the entire trial on its head. His testimony was so precise, so unexpected, that everyone in the room began to wonder if the jury would come back with a different verdict after hearing it. What could possibly make a child accuse someone so boldly, in front of strangers and cameras? And how could his words alter the fate of not just the accused, but his own family? It all began 3 months earlier. 9-year-old Caleb Washington had lived a quiet life with his grandmother, Betty, and older sister, Rachel, in a modest house in Detroit. Their family wasn't rich, but they were close-knit. Caleb was a curious child, always asking questions about the world, while Rachel, at 14, acted as his protector, sometimes bossy but always caring. Betty worked long shifts as a nurse, leaving Rachel to take charge at home. On one particularly muggy July evening, the three of them gathered at the dinner table when Betty announced, "I've got to pick up an extra shift tonight." Caleb frowned, disappointed that his grandmother wouldn't stay for their usual bedtime routine. But Betty kissed the top of his head and promised they'd read together tomorrow. Later that night, after Betty left, Caleb decided to sneak outside to watch the fireflies. He slipped out the back door and crouched near the fence that separated their yard from the neighbors. It was there that he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. A black car pulled up in front of the neighboring house, and a woman he didn't recognize stepped out. She was dressed in dark clothes, carrying what looked like a bag. Caleb couldn't make out her face clearly in the dim light, but something about her movements caught his attention. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she were being followed. Caleb leaned in closer, trying to stay hidden. The woman approached the front door of the house and knocked. When no one answered, she looked around again before taking a key from her pocket and letting herself inside. Caleb stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. He didn't know much about the neighbors, except that they were usually home this time of night. Moments later, Caleb heard raised voices from inside the house. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like an argument. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by silence. Caleb's heart raced as the woman emerged from the house, her bag noticeably fuller. She hurried back to the car, got in, and drove away without turning on the headlights. The next morning, the neighborhood was in chaos. Police cars lined the street, and yellow tape blocked off the house Caleb had watched the woman enter. Caleb overheard an officer telling Betty that someone had found Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, the elderly couple who lived there, unconscious. The police believed it was a robbery gone wrong. Caleb wanted to tell someone what he had seen, but fear kept his mouth shut. He didn't know who the woman was, and he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. Betty and Rachel noticed he was quieter than usual, but Caleb brushed off their concerns, pretending everything was fine. For weeks, Caleb kept his secret. He avoided the police officers canvassing the neighborhood, terrified they would somehow read his mind and learn what he knew. But the guilt ate away at him, especially after he overheard that Mrs. Patterson had died from her injuries. Then, one evening, while watching the news with Betty and Rachel, Caleb's stomach dropped. A mugshot of a young woman appeared on the screen. She was the one Caleb had seen that night. Her name was Emily Reed, and she had been arrested for an unrelated burglary. The police now suspected she was involved in the attack on the Pattersons. "That's her," Caleb whispered, staring at the screen. Rachel turned to him. "What are you talking about?" Caleb hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. "I saw her that night, at the Pattersons' house." Rachel's eyes widened, and she grabbed the remote to turn off the TV. "You need to tell Grandma." When Betty got home from work, Rachel and Caleb sat her down and told her everything. Betty's face grew grim as Caleb described what he had seen. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. "I was scared," Caleb admitted. Betty hugged him tightly. "You're brave for telling us now." The next day, Betty took Caleb to the police station. He told the detectives everything he remembered. They asked him dozens of questions, and though Caleb was nervous, he answered as best as he could. His testimony became a crucial part of the investigation, leading to Emily's trial. Now, standing in court, Caleb was about to face his biggest challenge yet. He had to relive the memory in front of strangers, lawyers, and the very woman he had seen that night. He was terrified, but he knew he had to do it. For the Pattersons, for his family, and for himself. The trial had been building to this moment. Caleb's testimony was the final piece of evidence the prosecution needed to secure a conviction. But as the boy sat down in the witness stand and the defense attorney approached, the courtroom held its breath. The attorney smirked, ready to tear apart Caleb's story. "Mr. Washington," the lawyer began, his tone dripping with doubt. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw that night?" Caleb swallowed hard, glancing at Betty and Rachel in the audience. His voice shook, but he replied, "Yes, I'm sure." Before the attorney could ask his next question, Emily leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer. Whatever she said made his expression falter. He turned back to Caleb, his questions suddenly losing their edge. Caleb didn't know it yet, but his brave words had just changed everything. And what happened next would shock everyone in the room. The room grew tense as Emily leaned closer to her attorney, whispering furiously. The lawyer's confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a look of concern. His voice lowered, and he leaned toward Emily, visibly uncomfortable. The judge cleared his throat, calling for order as murmurs spread across the courtroom. "Ms. Reed," the judge said sternly, "this is not the time for private conversations. Counsel, please proceed." The defense attorney hesitated, glancing nervously at Emily. He stood, adjusting his tie, before turning back to Caleb. "Mr. Washington," he began, his voice less commanding than before, "can you describe exactly what you saw that night? Every detail, no matter how small." Caleb sat up straighter, his small hands clutching the edges of the witness stand. He recounted everything. The dark car, the woman's suspicious behavior, the argument he overheard, and the bag she carried out of the house. Every word painted a clearer picture for the jury, and by the time he finished, the courtroom was eerily silent. The defense attorney attempted to poke holes in Caleb's story, suggesting his young age made his memory unreliable. But Caleb stood firm. "I know what I saw," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And it was her." Emily's attorney sighed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Caleb stepped down from the stand, he felt a mix of relief and dread. He had done his part, but the weight of his testimony hung heavy on his shoulders. He glanced at Betty and Rachel, who gave him small, reassuring smiles. Caleb wanted to believe everything would be okay, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. 2 days later, Caleb and his family sat in the living room, waiting for updates from the trial. The news anchor spoke solemnly, recounting the day's events in court. Caleb fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, his mind racing. Betty placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Caleb," she said softly. "No matter what happens, you should be proud of yourself." Rachel nodded in agreement. "You were so brave up there." But Caleb wasn't so sure. He couldn't stop thinking about the look Emily had given him in court, a mix of anger and something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't guilt, at least, not the kind he had expected. It was almost fear. The next morning, the family woke to a knock on the door. Betty opened it to find a police officer standing on their porch. Caleb froze, his heart pounding. Had something gone wrong? "Ms. Washington," the officer said, "I need to speak with Caleb. It's important." Betty's face tightened with worry, but she nodded. "Caleb, come here." Caleb stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the towering officer. Is everything okay?" he asked timidly. The officer crouched to Caleb's level, his expression serious but kind. "We believe Emily Reed is trying to change her plea. She's claiming she was forced to break into the Pattersons' home by someone else." "What?" Betty exclaimed. "She's blaming someone else now?" The officer nodded. "It's not uncommon in cases like this, but here's the thing. She's saying she was threatened. That the person who forced her to do it is still out there. Caleb's stomach churned. Who would do that? We don't know yet, the officer admitted. But her claim could complicate things. If she's telling the truth, it means there's more to this case than we realized. The officer thanked Caleb for his bravery and assured the family they would stay in touch. But as the door closed, an unsettling silence filled the room. Betty and Rachel exchanged worried glances. Do you think she's lying? Caleb asked quietly. Betty hesitated. I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever the truth is, we'll face it together. That night, Caleb had trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, heard her whispers in court. What if she wasn't lying? What if someone dangerous was out there, watching? Caleb shivered at the thought. Around midnight, a loud crash startled him awake. He bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. It sounded like it had come from outside. Caleb crept to his window and peeked through the curtains. In the dim light of the street lamp, he saw a shadowy figure near the fence where he had first seen Emily that fateful night. Rachel, Caleb hissed, rushing to his sister's room. Wake up, Rachel groaned, rubbing her eyes. What is it, Caleb? There's someone outside, he whispered urgently. By the fence. Rachel's sleepy expression turned serious. She grabbed her phone and followed Caleb to his room. They both peered out the window, but the figure was gone. I swear I saw someone, Caleb insisted. Rachel frowned, dialing Betty, who was working the night shift. Mom's going to flip if we don't tell her, Rachel muttered, waiting for her grandmother to pick up. Betty answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. Rachel? What's wrong? There was someone in the yard, Rachel said quickly. Caleb saw them. Betty cursed under her breath. Stay inside. Lock the doors and windows. I'll be home as soon as I can. By the time Betty arrived, the yard was empty, but the unease lingered. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been out there wasn't just some random person. They had been watching. The next day, Betty reported the incident to the police, but without any solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Caleb spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound and glancing nervously out the window. By evening, the family tried to settle into their usual routine, but the tension was palpable. Betty cooked dinner while Rachel helped Caleb with his homework, but none of them could fully relax. As Caleb finished his last math problem, there was another knock at the door. Betty froze, the knife she was holding clattering onto the counter. Rachel grabbed Caleb's hand, pulling him close. Who is it? Betty called out, her voice steady but wary. No answer. She cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. What she saw made her gasp. Standing on the porch was a man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by a hat. He wasn't moving, just standing there like a statue. Betty turned to Rachel and Caleb, her voice low. Go to your rooms. Lock the doors. Caleb's heart raced as Rachel pulled him down the hall. But before they could reach their rooms, the man outside knocked again, harder this time. Then, to their horror, he tried the doorknob. The lock held, but the sound of it rattling sent chills down Caleb's spine. He clung to Rachel, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man, and what did he want? Betty grabbed the baseball bat she kept by the door and squared her shoulders, her grip tightening. She motioned for Rachel and Caleb to stay out of sight, but Caleb peeked around the corner, his small body trembling. The man outside continued to rattle the doorknob, his persistence sending shivers down Caleb's spine. Who are you? Betty called out, her voice firm. What do you want? There was no response. The man stopped twisting the knob, but instead of leaving, he leaned closer to the door. Betty could hear his shallow breaths through the wood. I know what your boy saw, the man finally said, his voice low and menacing. Tell him to stay quiet or else. Betty's blood ran cold. She tightened her grip on the bat, her heart pounding in her chest. You get away from my house before I call the police, she yelled. The man chuckled, a dark, unsettling sound. Go ahead, he said, stepping back. But remember, you've been warned. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Betty stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. When she finally moved, she bolted the door and checked every lock in the house twice before calling the police. The officers arrived within minutes, but the man was long gone. Caleb and Rachel sat on the couch, clinging to each other, while Betty explained what had happened. He said he knew what my grandson saw, Betty told the officer. He was threatening us. The officer nodded gravely. It's possible this is related to the trial. We'll increase patrols in the area, and I'll file a report. But without more information, there's not much else we can do. Betty's frustration boiled over. Not much you can do. My grandson is just a child, and someone is threatening him for telling the truth. The officer held up his hands. I understand, ma'am. We'll do everything we can to keep your family safe. If you notice anything suspicious, call us immediately. As the officers left, Betty locked the door behind them and turned to Caleb and Rachel. We're going to be okay, she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. I won't let anything happen to us. Caleb wanted to believe her, but the fear in her eyes told him she was just as scared as he was. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension in the house was palpable. Betty kept the curtains drawn, and Rachel wasn't allowed to walk Caleb to school alone anymore. Betty had arranged for a family friend to drive them, but Caleb felt like a prisoner in his own home. At school, Caleb couldn't focus. His teacher, Mrs. Green, noticed his distracted behavior and pulled him aside after class. Is everything okay, Caleb? She asked gently. Caleb hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Just stuff at home, he mumbled. Mrs. Green didn't press further, but gave him a warm smile. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. That night, as Caleb lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He kept the curtains tightly closed, but the creak of every floorboard and the rustle of leaves outside made his imagination run wild. He finally drifted off to sleep, only to be jolted awake hours later by the sound of glass shattering. Rachel burst into his room, her face pale. Someone's in the house, she whispered, dragging him out of bed. Caleb's heart pounded as they crept down the hallway. Betty was already in the living room, clutching the bat again. The shattered glass from the back door glittered on the floor, and a cold draft filled the room. The house was eerily silent. Stay behind me, Betty whispered, her voice trembling. They slowly moved toward the kitchen, where the broken glass lay. Betty flipped on the light, revealing the back door swinging open in the wind. The yard beyond was empty. Did they leave? Rachel whispered. Betty didn't answer. She stepped cautiously toward the door, peering into the darkness outside. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the living room. Rachel screamed, and Caleb clung to her as Betty spun around, raising the bat. A shadowy figure stood near the couch, their face obscured by a mask. The intruder didn't move, just stood there, staring at them. Get out of my house, Betty shouted, her voice shaking with rage. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if amused. Then, without warning, they lunged toward Betty. She swung the bat with all her strength, but the intruder ducked and grabbed her arm, twisting it. Betty cried out in pain, dropping the bat. Grandma! Caleb screamed, tears streaming down his face. The intruder froze at the sound of Caleb's voice. For a moment, they seemed to hesitate, their grip on Betty loosening. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and ran, disappearing out the broken back door. The police arrived minutes later, but once again, the intruder was gone. Betty's arm was bruised but not broken, and the officers assured her they would do everything they could to find the person responsible. That's not good enough, Betty said through gritted teeth. My family is in danger, and you need to do something about it. We'll assign an officer to patrol outside your house, one of the officers said. But until we catch this person, you need to stay alert. Caleb sat on the couch, trembling. He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. The way the intruder had looked at him, the way they had hesitated when he screamed. It was almost as if they knew him. As the police left, Betty gathered Caleb and Rachel in her arms. I don't care what it takes, she said fiercely. We're going to get through this, and we're going to find out who's behind all of this. But Caleb wasn't so sure. The fear in his heart was growing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Who was the intruder, and why did they hesitate when they heard his voice? The next morning, Caleb woke up to the sound of a car idling outside. For a split second, He panicked, his mind flashing back to the intruder from the night before. He jumped out of bed and peeked through the curtains, but it was just a police cruiser parked across the street. An officer sat in the driver's seat, sipping coffee and scanning the area. Betty had insisted on the extra patrols, and though Caleb felt a little safer knowing someone was watching, he couldn't shake the unease in his chest. What if the intruder came back? What if they didn't care about the police presence? Rachel knocked on his door and poked her head in. "Hey," she said softly, "you okay?" Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. Rachel stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed. "Grandma's making pancakes. She says we need a good breakfast after last night." Caleb managed a small smile. "Okay." Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like butter and syrup, and Betty was humming softly as she flipped pancakes on the stove. She looked up when Caleb and Rachel entered, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, pulling Caleb into a hug. "How are you feeling?" "Okay, I guess," Caleb mumbled, leaning into her embrace. Betty placed a plate of pancakes in front of him, topped with a generous dollop of whipped cream. "Eat up," she said. "We've got a lot to do today." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm not waiting around for the police to solve this," Betty said, her tone firm. "We're going to figure out who's behind this ourselves." After breakfast, Betty sat Caleb and Rachel down at the dining table with a notebook and pen. "Let's start with what we know," she said. "Caleb, tell me everything you remember about the intruder." Caleb hesitated, the memory still fresh and raw. "They were wearing a mask," he began, "and a dark hoodie. I couldn't see their face." "Did they say anything?" Betty asked. Caleb shook his head. "No, but when I yelled, they stopped. Like they recognized my voice or something." Betty tapped her pen against the notebook, her brow furrowed. "That's interesting. If they recognized your voice, it means they know you, or at least, they've heard you before." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Do you think it's someone from the trial? Like, maybe someone working with Emily?" "It's possible," Betty admitted. "But we don't have enough to go on yet." That afternoon, Betty decided to visit the police station again, hoping to push the detectives for more information. She brought Caleb and Rachel along, partly because she didn't want to leave them alone and partly because she felt they deserved answers too. At the station, they were greeted by Detective Harris, a tall man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He led them into his office and closed the door behind them. "Mrs. Washington," he said, sitting down at his desk, "I understand your frustration, but we're doing everything we can to keep your family safe." "I appreciate that," Betty said, her voice steady, "but I need to know more about Emily Reed's claims. She said someone forced her to break into the Pattersons' house. Has she said who?" Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Emily has been tight-lipped about who she's accusing. She claims she was threatened, but hasn't provided any names. Frankly, we think she's stalling for time. What if she's telling the truth?" Caleb blurted out. Harris turned to him, his expression softening. "It's possible, but until we have concrete evidence, we have to treat her claim with caution." Betty folded her arms. "What about the man who came to our house? He said he knew what Caleb saw." "That can't be a coincidence. We're investigating that angle," Harris assured her. "But it's going to take time." Betty's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Time we don't have," she muttered under her breath. That night, Caleb lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. Who was the intruder? Why had they hesitated when he yelled? And what did they mean by "I know what your boy saw"? Unable to sleep, Caleb got up and wandered into the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He sat on the couch, pulling a blanket over his shoulders, and stared out the window at the police cruiser parked across the street. As he sat there, lost in thought, a movement outside caught his eye. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he saw a figure dart between the parked cars. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was imagining things. But then he saw it again, a shadowy figure moving toward the house. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to scream, to wake Betty and Rachel, but his voice felt stuck. The figure approached the front porch, and Caleb's stomach turned as he realized they weren't trying to be stealthy. Whoever it was wanted to be seen. Finally, Caleb found his voice. "Grandma!" he yelled, scrambling off the couch. "Someone's outside." Betty and Rachel came rushing into the living room just as the doorbell rang. Betty grabbed the bat, her face grim, and motioned for Rachel to stay with Caleb. "Who is it?" Betty called out, her voice firm. There was no answer. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Betty approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Her breath hitched, and she stepped back, her face pale. "What is it?" Rachel whispered, clutching Caleb's hand. Betty shook her head, her voice barely audible. "It's Emily." Before anyone could process what was happening, Emily's voice rang out from the other side of the door. "I need to talk to Caleb. He's in danger." Betty's grip on the bat tightened, her knuckles turning white. Rachel and Caleb exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room was suffocating as Emily's muffled voice came through the door again. "Please," she said, sounding desperate. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. Caleb needs to know the truth." Betty glanced back at her grandchildren. "Go to your rooms. Now." "But," Caleb began, his voice shaky. "Now," Betty said firmly, her eyes locked on the door. Rachel reluctantly grabbed Caleb's hand and pulled him down the hall. They stopped just around the corner, close enough to hear but out of sight. Caleb's heart raced as he strained to listen. Betty took a deep breath and opened the door, keeping the chain lock in place. Emily stood on the porch, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Her once polished appearance was gone. She looked disheveled, her hair tangled and her clothes wrinkled. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," Betty hissed, her voice low and venomous. "What do you want?" Emily's eyes darted nervously to the street, then back to Betty. "I had no choice. They're coming for him." Betty's jaw clenched. "Who's coming for him? What are you talking about?" Emily leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people who made me do it. The ones who forced me to break into the Pattersons' house. They know Caleb saw me, and they won't stop until he's silenced." Betty's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe that? You're just trying to save yourself." Emily shook her head frantically. "I'm telling the truth. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but they threatened my family. They said if I didn't do what they asked, they'd come after my little sister. I didn't have a choice. Why should I trust you?" Betty asked, her voice hard. "Because I don't have anything left to lose," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "If they find out I came here, they'll kill me. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Caleb's a kid. He doesn't deserve this." Betty hesitated, studying Emily's face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she sighed and closed the door just long enough to unhook the chain. She opened it again and motioned for Emily to come inside. "You have 5 minutes," Betty said, stepping aside. "If this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," Emily said quickly, stepping into the house. She glanced nervously around the room as Betty locked the door behind her. Rachel and Caleb peeked out from their hiding spot as Emily sat on the couch, her hands trembling. Betty stood over her, arms crossed, the bat still in her hand. "Start talking," Betty demanded. Emily took a deep breath. "The people who made me break into the Pattersons' house, they're part of something big, a criminal network. They rob houses, launder money, even deal drugs. They use people like me, people who are desperate, to do their dirty work." "Why the Pattersons?" Betty asked. "What did they want from them?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know everything, but I heard they were looking for something. Documents, maybe? The Pattersons were supposed to have some kind of evidence that could expose them." "Expose them how?" Betty pressed. Emily shook her head. "I don't know. I was just told to get in, grab anything that looked important, and get out. But it went wrong. Mr. Patterson woke up, and things got out of hand." Caleb stepped into the room before Betty could stop him. "Why did they come after me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I didn't do anything." Emily looked at him with a mix of guilt and fear. "Because you saw me that night, and they know you could identify me. They think you might know more than you're saying." "I don't," Caleb cried. "I don't know anything else." "I believe you," Emily said softly, "but they don't. And if they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to get rid of you." Rachel stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Caleb. So what do we do now? Just wait for them to show up? No, Emily said firmly. We need to get ahead of them. If we can find out what they're after, what the Pattersons had, we might have a chance to stop them. Betty frowned. And how do you suggest we do that? March into their house and start asking questions? Emily hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I kept this, she said, handing it to Betty. It's an address. I overheard them talking about it before the break-in. I think it's where they keep their records. Betty unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the address. And you expect me to just trust you on this? I know I don't deserve your trust, Emily said, but it's the only lead we have. Later that night, as the family huddled in the living room, the weight of Emily's revelations hung heavy in the air. Betty had called Detective Harris to report what Emily had said, but he warned them not to take any action without police backup. Still, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. What do you think, Grandma? Rachel asked quietly. Betty sighed, staring at the address in her hand. I think we're in over our heads. Before anyone could respond, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. The family froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Stay here, Betty said, grabbing the bat. She crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. Her heart stopped. There were two men in dark suits standing on the porch. One of them looked directly at the peephole, his face cold and expressionless. Open the door, he said, his voice loud and commanding. We need to talk. Betty's hands shook as she backed away from the door. Caleb's heart raced, his mind screaming with questions. Who were these men, and how had they found them so quickly? Betty's grip on the bat tightened as she backed away from the door, her heart pounding. Rachel pulled Caleb behind her, her eyes wide with fear. Emily sat frozen on the couch, her face pale as a sheet. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. We know you're in there, he called out. We just want to talk. Betty shook her head, her voice low but firm. Rachel, take Caleb to the basement. Now. Rachel hesitated, glancing at the door, but then nodded. She grabbed Caleb's hand and pulled him toward the basement door. Caleb resisted, his voice a frightened whisper. Grandma, what about you? I'll be fine, Betty said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. Go. Rachel and Caleb disappeared down the basement stairs just as the knocking turned into loud, deliberate banging. Emily stood, her hands raised defensively. Betty, she whispered, you can't open the door. You think I don't know that? Betty snapped, her eyes locked on the door. The banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Betty's stomach churned as she waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, a loud crash shattered the stillness. The front door burst open, the lock splintering under the force of a well-placed kick. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions cold and calculating. Get out of my house, Betty shouted, raising the bat. One of the men raised his hands in mock surrender. Easy, ma'am, he said, his voice smooth and unsettling. We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need to have a conversation. Breaking down my door doesn't exactly scream friendly. Betty shot back, her grip on the bat unwavering. The second man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Emily. You weren't supposed to come here, he said, his tone low and menacing. You've made things very complicated. Emily took a step back, her voice trembling. I didn't have a choice. You can't do this to them. Caleb's just a kid. The first man smirked. And you think running here is going to save him? All you've done is make things worse. For all of you. Betty swung the bat, aiming for the man closest to her, but he sidestepped it easily. Before she could react, he grabbed the bat and wrenched it from her hands, tossing it across the room. Let's not make this harder than it has to be, he said. Where's the boy? Betty glared at him, her voice filled with defiance. You'll have to go through me first. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a steely glare. I don't have time for this, he said, nodding to his partner. The second man moved toward the hallway, where the basement door stood slightly ajar. Betty stepped in his path, trying to block his way, but the first man grabbed her arm and shoved her roughly aside. Grandma! Caleb's voice echoed from the basement, high-pitched with fear. The men froze, their eyes snapping toward the sound. Emily darted forward, grabbing a vase from the coffee table and smashing it against the nearest man's head. He stumbled, swearing loudly, as shards of glass rained down around him. "Run!" Emily shouted to Betty. Betty scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she moved toward the basement door. But before she could reach it, the second man grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be," he growled, his grip tightening. Down in the basement, Rachel and Caleb huddled together in the dark, their hearts pounding. They could hear the commotion upstairs, the shouting, the crashing sounds, and every fiber of Caleb's being screamed at him to do something. "We can't just stay here," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Rachel shook her head. "Grandma told us to stay put. We'll only make it worse if we go up there." "But they're hurting her," Caleb said, tears streaming down his face. Rachel squeezed his hand tightly. "We have to trust Grandma. She knows what she's doing." A loud thud from upstairs made both of them jump. Caleb couldn't take it anymore. He pulled away from Rachel and ran up the stairs before she could stop him. "Caleb, no!" Rachel hissed, chasing after him. When Caleb reached the top of the stairs, the scene before him made his stomach drop. Betty was on the floor, clutching her arm, while Emily struggled against one of the men, who had her pinned against the wall. The other man turned as Caleb appeared, his cold eyes narrowing. "There he is," the man said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Caleb froze, his legs trembling. Rachel appeared behind him, pulling him back protectively, but the man took a step forward. "You've been very brave, Caleb," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "But this is grown-up business. You don't need to be involved. Stay away from him." Rachel shouted, her voice cracking. The man ignored her, his focus solely on Caleb. "Just come with us, and no one else has to get hurt." "No," Caleb yelled, his voice shaking with emotion. "I won't go with you." Betty, still on the floor, mustered her strength and lunged at the man's legs, throwing him off balance. Emily took the opportunity to elbow the second man in the ribs, freeing herself from his grip. "Run!" Emily screamed. "Get out of here!" Rachel grabbed Caleb's hand and pulled him toward the back door, but the men were already recovering. One of them lunged for Caleb, his fingers brushing the back of the boy's shirt. In that split second, Caleb acted on pure instinct. He grabbed the fallen bat from the floor and swung it with all his might, hitting the man square in the stomach. The man doubled over, gasping for air, giving Caleb and Rachel just enough time to slip through the broken back door and into the night. The siblings ran as fast as they could, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind them, they could hear shouting as the men gave chase. Caleb's legs burned, but he didn't dare slow down. He didn't know where they were running to, only that they had to get away. As they rounded the corner of the street, Caleb spotted the police cruiser parked nearby. "Over there!" he cried, pulling Rachel toward it. The officer inside had already stepped out, alerted by the commotion. He drew his weapon as Caleb and Rachel ran toward him, their faces pale with fear. "They're after us!" Rachel screamed. "They're in the house!" The officer's eyes narrowed, and he radioed for backup. Just as the two men appeared at the end of the street, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The men froze, exchanging a tense glance, before retreating into the shadows. Caleb collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. The officer knelt beside him, his voice steady but concerned. "You're safe now, kid," he said. "We've got you." But as Caleb looked back toward his house, where Betty and Emily were still inside, he knew this was far from over. Who were those men, and what would they do next now that their plans had been interrupted? The sirens grew louder as several police cars screeched to a stop outside the Washington home. Officers poured out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the house. Caleb and Rachel huddled near the police cruiser, their breaths shaky and uneven. Inside, Betty was sitting on the floor, her arm cradled against her chest. Emily was leaning against the wall, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Both women flinched as the front door burst open, and a group of officers entered, their weapons drawn. Detroit police. Hands where we can see them, an officer barked. They're gone, Betty said weakly, raising her good hand. They went after the kids. One officer knelt beside her, while others spread out to secure the house. Emily's legs gave out, and she slid to the floor, her back against the wall. Are Caleb and Rachel okay? She asked, her voice hoarse. They're safe, the officer said. We found them outside. You both need medical attention. Caleb and Rachel watched nervously as Betty and Emily were brought out of the house on stretchers. Betty spotted them immediately and tried to sit up, but the paramedics gently pushed her back down. I'm fine, she insisted, her eyes scanning for Caleb. Where are my grandkids? We're here, Grandma, Caleb called, running to her side. Betty sighed in relief, reaching out to touch his cheek. Thank God, she whispered. Are you hurt? Caleb shook his head. No, but I was so scared. I thought. Shoo, Betty said, her voice soft but firm. We're okay. That's all that matters. Rachel stood behind Caleb, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at Betty, then at Emily, who was being loaded into the ambulance. What's going to happen now? The officer who had helped Caleb earlier approached, his expression serious. That's what we're here to figure out, he said. But I can tell you one thing. This isn't over. Later that night, after Betty and Emily were taken to the hospital for treatment, Caleb and Rachel were brought to the police station. Detective Harris met them in his office, his face grim. You've been through a lot tonight, he said, sitting across from them. But we need your help to piece this together. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Caleb recounted everything. The men breaking into the house, their threats, and the desperate escape. Harris listened intently, taking notes. When Caleb finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. These men, Harris said slowly, they're not just petty criminals. They're part of something much bigger. What do you mean? Rachel asked. Harris glanced at her, his expression unreadable. We've been tracking a group like this for months. They're connected to multiple crimes, robberies, assaults, even homicides. But we've never been able to pin anything on them. They're careful, and they don't leave loose ends. Then why are they after us? Caleb asked, his voice trembling. Because you're a witness, Harris said bluntly. You saw something they don't want anyone else to know. And now that Emily's turned against them, they see your family as a threat. Rachel's fists clenched. So what are you going to do about it? Harris leaned forward, his tone reassuring. We're going to protect you. Starting tonight, you'll be placed under police watch. No one will get near you. But for how long? Caleb asked. Are we supposed to just live like this forever? We're working on finding them, Harris said. Emily's testimony is key. If she cooperates, we might be able to take the entire network down. Caleb glanced at Rachel, his stomach twisting into knots. He wasn't sure he could trust Harris's promise. The men who had come for them weren't just criminals. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The next day, Betty was discharged from the hospital with her arm in a sling. Emily, still shaken but otherwise unharmed, joined them back at the house. An unmarked police car was parked outside, and 2 officers had been assigned to guard the family. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the address she had given Betty. I don't know if this will help, she said quietly, but it's all I've got. Betty sighed, sitting down across from her. You're putting a lot of faith in this address. What if it's a dead end? Emily looked up, her eyes filled with guilt. Then I've failed you. Betty studied her for a moment before shaking her head. You've already done more than I expected. But if we're going to get through this, we need to be smart. Rachel leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. What's the plan then? Betty glanced at her, then at Caleb. We wait for the police to do their job. In the meantime, we stay vigilant. Caleb frowned. But what if they don't find them? What if they come back? Betty's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the address Emily had given them. What if it was the key to everything? What if it could stop the men from coming after them? Finally, Caleb made a decision. He slipped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and crept downstairs. The address was still on the table, and Caleb picked it up, his heart pounding. He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't sit back and do nothing. Just as he was about to head for the door, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Caleb yelped, spinning around to see Rachel standing behind him, her arms crossed. "What are you doing?" she hissed. I was just," Caleb stammered, clutching the paper. "You were going to go there, weren't you?" Rachel said, her voice rising. "Are you out of your mind? That place could be crawling with those guys." "I have to do something," Caleb shot back. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us again." Rachel stared at him, her expression torn. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. But if you're going, I'm coming with you." Caleb's eyes widened. "Rachel, no. Don't argue with me," she said firmly. "If you're doing this, you're not doing it alone." Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Together, they slipped out the back door and into the night, clutching the crumpled piece of paper that might hold the key to their survival. Neither of them could have predicted the danger that awaited them at the end of the address. Caleb and Rachel crept through the quiet neighborhood, their breaths visible in the chilly night air. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows as they moved cautiously toward their destination. Caleb clutched the crumpled address in his hand, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "No," Caleb admitted, his voice barely audible. "But we have to do something." Rachel sighed but didn't argue. She kept a protective arm around Caleb as they navigated the unfamiliar streets, following the directions scribbled on the paper. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the address, a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town. The building loomed over them, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. A single light flickered above the main entrance, casting an ominous glow. Caleb hesitated, his legs suddenly feeling like lead. "This place is creepy," Rachel muttered, her eyes scanning the dark surroundings. "Are you sure this is it?" Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. "It's the address Emily gave us." Rachel reached out and grabbed his hand. "Stay close," she said. "If anything feels off, we leave. No questions." Caleb nodded again, and together they approached the warehouse. The heavy metal door was slightly ajar, and Rachel pushed it open cautiously. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rust. Rows of rusted shelves stretched into the darkness, filled with dusty boxes and discarded equipment. Caleb shone his flashlight around, illuminating the room in brief, flickering bursts. "What are we even looking for?" Rachel whispered. "Anything that can prove Emily's story," Caleb replied. "Maybe something about the people who are after us." They moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the layer of grime on the floor. Caleb's flashlight caught a glint of metal, and he turned to see a filing cabinet partially hidden behind a stack of crates. "Over there," he said, pointing. Rachel followed him to the cabinet, and together they pried it open. Inside were stacks of folders, each labeled with cryptic names and dates. Caleb flipped through them, his hands trembling. "These look important," he said, pulling out a folder labeled Operations Patterson. Rachel's eyes widened. "That's their name. The Pattersons." Caleb nodded, opening the folder. Inside were several documents, including blueprints, photographs, and what looked like a list of names. Caleb's stomach churned as he recognized some of the names from news reports about missing persons and unsolved crimes. "This is it," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This proves everything." Rachel nodded, but before they could celebrate, a noise from the far end of the warehouse made them freeze. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the space, growing louder with each passing second. "Someone's here," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. Caleb shoved the folder into his backpack, and they ducked behind a stack of crates. Peeking through a gap, Caleb's heart sank as he saw two men enter the warehouse. One of them was the man from their house, the one who had kicked down their door. "Check the cabinets," the man barked, his voice cold and commanding. "If the kids got here, they'll have taken something." The second man nodded and began rifling through the shelves, his movements quick and methodical. Caleb and Rachel huddled closer together, their breaths shallow as they tried to remain silent. Rachel leaned close to Caleb's ear. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "How?" Caleb mouthed, his eyes darting toward the entrance, which was now blocked by the men. Rachel scanned the room, her mind racing. Her eyes landed on a stack of pipes leaning against the wall nearby. She nudged Caleb and pointed. "We'll create a distraction." Caleb's eyes widened in alarm. "Are you crazy?" "Trust me," Rachel said, her voice firm. "When they go to check it out, we run for the back exit." Before Caleb could argue, Rachel grabbed a loose bolt from the ground and hurled it toward the pipes. It hit with a loud clang, sending the pipes crashing to the floor in a deafening cacophony. "What was that?" one of the men shouted, spinning around. "Go check it out," the other ordered. As one of the men moved toward the noise, Rachel grabbed Caleb's hand. "Now," she whispered. They bolted from their hiding spot, darting between shelves and crates as quietly as they could. Caleb's heart pounded so loudly he was sure the men would hear it. They spotted a small side door near the back of the warehouse and sprinted toward it. Just as they reached the door, the second man shouted, "Hey, stop!" Caleb and Rachel didn't look back. They burst through the door and into the cold night air, running as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind them, they could hear the men shouting and the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement. "This way!" Rachel yelled, pulling Caleb down a narrow alley. They zigzagged through the dark streets, their lungs burning and their legs aching. Finally, they ducked into a small, abandoned shed and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. "Do you think we lost them?" Caleb asked between breaths. Rachel peered through a crack in the shed's wall, her body tense. After a few moments, she nodded. "I think so." Caleb pulled the folder out of his backpack and stared at it. "We have to get this to Detective Harris," he said. "This proves everything." Rachel nodded, but her expression was grim. "We'll go first thing in the morning." "But Caleb, those men aren't going to stop. They know we were there." Caleb swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. They had the evidence, but at what cost? And how long before the men found them again? The shed was silent except for the sound of Caleb and Rachel's breathing as they huddled in the cold, dim space. Caleb clutched the folder tightly, his fingers gripping the edges as if it might vanish. Rachel leaned against the wall, her eyes darting nervously toward the cracks, watching for any sign of movement outside. "Do you think they'll come back?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Rachel sighed. "They might, but we're not going to let them catch us. We just need to make it through the night." Caleb nodded, but the fear in his chest refused to fade. He couldn't stop thinking about Betty, still at the house with Emily and the officers. What if the men went back there? What if this wasn't over? Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the shed's walls. Caleb and Rachel hadn't slept. The adrenaline coursing through their veins had kept them awake and alert. As the sun rose higher, Rachel stood and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. "We need to move," she said, brushing dirt off her clothes. "Let's get to the police station before those men figure out where we went." Caleb nodded, clutching the folder to his chest as they stepped out of the shed. The morning air was crisp and quiet, and the streets were almost empty. The siblings moved quickly, keeping to side roads and alleys to avoid being seen. When they arrived at the police station, they were immediately ushered into Detective Harris's office. His eyes widened in surprise as they entered, their disheveled appearances telling him something had gone wrong. "What happened?" Harris asked, standing to greet them. Caleb placed the folder on the desk, his hands shaking. "We went to the warehouse," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We found this." Harris's expression darkened as he opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, and his jaw tightened. This is big," Harris muttered, setting the folder down. "If this information is accurate, it links these men to dozens of crimes across the city and beyond." "We barely got out of there," Rachel said, her voice laced with frustration. "They showed up while we were still inside." Harris's head snapped up. "You were seen?" Caleb nodded, his stomach twisting. "They chased us, but we got away." Harris leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This complicates things. If they know you took this, they'll be coming after you, and they won't stop. Harris wasted no time. Within the hour, the police station was buzzing with activity. Officers were dispatched to secure Betty and Emily, and a protective detail was assigned to Caleb and Rachel. Harris also sent a team to the warehouse to investigate further. Back at the house, Betty was relieved when Caleb and Rachel returned under police escort, though her relief quickly turned to anger when she learned what they had done. "You could have been killed," Betty scolded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "What were you thinking?" "We were thinking about stopping those men," Rachel shot back. "And we did. We got the evidence," Betty sighed, pulling Caleb into a tight hug. "You're brave, both of you. But don't ever scare me like that again." For a moment, it seemed like they were safe. The police presence around the house was stronger than ever, and Harris assured them that the evidence they had recovered was a major breakthrough in the case. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. That night, as the family tried to settle down, Caleb sat in the living room, staring out the window. The police cruiser was parked across the street, and 2 officers stood guard at the front door. But even with the added security, Caleb felt uneasy. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked, sitting down beside him. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "It just feels like it's not over." Rachel sighed, putting an arm around him. "You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel that way." Caleb nodded, but he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread in his gut. In the middle of the night, Caleb woke to the sound of glass shattering. His eyes flew open, and for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But then he heard it again. A loud crash, followed by muffled voices. "Rachel," Caleb whispered, shaking her awake. "Someone's in the house." Rachel bolted upright, her eyes wide. "Stay here," she whispered, grabbing her phone. But Caleb didn't listen. He followed her as she crept down the hallway toward the living room. The sight that greeted them made Caleb's blood run cold. The front door was wide open, and the 2 officers who had been guarding it were lying unconscious on the floor. 2 men stood in the doorway, their faces partially obscured by shadows. One of them spotted Caleb and Rachel and pointed. "There they are." Caleb's heart leapt into his throat as the men started toward them. Rachel grabbed his arm and pulled him back toward the hallway, shouting for Betty. "Grandma, they're here." Betty emerged from her room, clutching a lamp as a makeshift weapon. "Get away from my grandkids," she shouted, stepping between the men and the hallway. The men hesitated for a split second, but then one of them lunged at Betty, knocking the lamp out of her hands. Betty stumbled but stood her ground, shouting for Caleb and Rachel to run. "Go," she yelled. "Get out of here." Caleb and Rachel hesitated, their feet rooted to the spot, but Betty's fierce glare snapped them out of it. They turned and ran, their hearts pounding as the sounds of the struggle echoed behind them. They didn't know where they were running to, only that they had to escape. Caleb's mind raced as they burst through the back door and into the yard. But as they reached the fence, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was the man who had spoken to Betty at the house days earlier. He smirked, his cold eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. Trapped and outnumbered, Caleb and Rachel had no idea how they were going to escape this time. Caleb's breath hitched as the man stepped closer, his shadow stretching long under the pale moonlight. Rachel stood in front of him, shielding him with her body, her eyes darting around, searching desperately for an escape. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, kid," the man said, his tone calm but dripping with menace. "Hand over the folder, and maybe we'll let this end without any more complications." Caleb clutched his backpack tighter, his heart pounding. "We don't have it," he lied, his voice trembling. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar, kid. Now, how about we stop wasting time?" Behind them, the back door of the house slammed open. Betty stumbled out, her arms still in a sling, but her face was resolute. She held a kitchen knife in her good hand, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You get away from my family," Betty growled, her voice steady despite the odds. The man sighed, clearly irritated. "I was hoping to avoid this," he said, signaling to the other men emerging from the house. But it seems you people just don't know when to quit. As the men advanced, the sound of screeching tires suddenly pierced the air. Headlights flooded the yard as multiple police cars swarmed the scene, their sirens blaring. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Freeze! Hands in the air. The men froze, their plan unraveling in an instant. One of them tried to run, but an officer tackled him to the ground before he could take 2 steps. The man who had spoken to Caleb raised his hands slowly, his expression cold and calculating. "This isn't over," he muttered, glaring at Caleb. "Yes, it is," Betty snapped, stepping forward as officers surrounded the men. "You don't mess with my family and walk away." Inside the house, Detective Harris was among the officers securing the scene. He pulled Caleb and Rachel aside, kneeling to meet their frightened eyes. "Are you two okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Caleb nodded shakily. "They wanted the folder. They said it wasn't over." Harris placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Caleb. Because of you, we finally have enough to take them down. They won't be able to hurt anyone else." Rachel's voice was sharp. "What about Emily? Is she safe?" "She's fine," Harris assured them. "She's been moved to a secure location for her protection." Betty stepped into the room, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Harris stood and nodded. "We've arrested most of their crew, and the evidence you found ties them directly to multiple crimes. It's going to take time, but this group is finished." In the days that followed, life slowly began to return to normal for the Washington family. The repairs to their house were underway, and the police kept a close eye on them, ensuring their safety. Betty was hailed as a hero for her bravery, and Caleb and Rachel were commended for their courage in the face of danger. Emily's testimony, combined with the evidence Caleb and Rachel had recovered, led to a string of indictments. The criminal network crumbled under the weight of the charges, and their leaders faced lengthy prison sentences. One afternoon, as the family sat together on the porch, Caleb looked up at Betty. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. Betty smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "It's over, sweetheart. And you were the one who made it happen." Rachel leaned back in her chair, letting out a long sigh. "You were pretty brave back there, Caleb. Don't let it go to your head." Caleb grinned, the first genuine smile he'd had in days. "I couldn't have done it without you." The family sat in peaceful silence, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. They knew the memories of what they had endured would linger, but they also knew they had faced something extraordinary together and come out stronger. And though Caleb would always remember the fear, he would also remember the moment he stood up in court and spoke the truth. His words had changed everything, not just for the Pattersons or for Emily, but for his own family. Because courage, he realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing up and doing the right thing anyway.